Avigdor Lieberman is touring Africa. After his somewhat modest performance in other parts of the world, Israel's foreign minister seems desperate to promote his country's interests in Africa. What are the strategic Israeli objectives in Africa? And is it advancing to fill a vacuum left by retreating Arab presence in the continent? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Imran Garda. 5 countries, 9 days. Israel's foreign minister tours sub-Saharan Africa for the first time in more than 20 years. Avigdor Lieberman says the tour is aimed at developing ties with African nationals and countering Iran's growing influence. Israel hopes closer ties with Africa will help at the UN, where African countries often vote in blocs. Well, he expressed hopes that African states will not take part in unilateral decisions taken against Israel. Lieberman is joined by around 20 Israeli businessmen, including experts in energy, agriculture, shipping, irrigation, infrastructure, chemistry, media and security. Well, the Israeli foreign minister hinted at the possible African role in achieving Middle Eastern peace.
We look to Africa to help promote moderation and reconciliation in the Middle East. Africa's ties with Arab and Muslim countries, whether within the framework of the Arab League, the Islamic Conference or the African Union, place the countries of Africa in a position to contribute positive influence.
Well, under the broad banner of strengthening bilateral economic and business relations between the countries, what does Lieberman intend to achieve in the 5 countries? Well, his visit to Africa began on Wednesday in Ethiopia, where Lieberman inaugurated a project to help Ethiopia develop its agriculture sector. The 2 countries also signed a memorandum of understanding. Visiting Kenya on Friday, Lieberman and the Kenyan Minister for Water and Irrigation are to sign an agreement on water. On the 7th of September, Lieberman is expected to be in Ghana. He's scheduled to meet Ghana's president and foreign minister and open an economic forum. A day later, he'll be in Nigeria signing a trade agreement and a memorandum of understanding. His African tour will end in Uganda on the 10th of September. Lieberman hopes to strengthen diplomatic and economic ties between the 2 countries. Well, joining us now are our guests in Cairo, Gamal Nkrumah. He's the deputy editor of the newspaper Al-Ahram Weekly. In Jerusalem, Herb Keenan. He's a journalist and columnist for the Jerusalem Post. And in Dubai, Hamdi Abdurrahman. He is a professor of political science, at Cairo University. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us. Gamal Nkrumah, if I could start off with you. Is this business as usual for Israel in Africa, or is this a sign of a desperate foreign minister traveling first to South America and then Africa after a frosty reception in other parts of the world?
Well, I think it's very different in Africa for the Israeli foreign minister, Lieberman. I think Israel is seizing an opportunity. There is a lack of interest in Africa by the key Arab countries, and the 5 countries that Lieberman has chosen to visit in sub-Saharan Africa are the main economic powerhouses of West Africa, Ghana and Nigeria, as well as the Nile Basin countries of Ethiopia, Kenya and Uganda in East Africa.
You mentioned economic powerhouses. Why hasn't he then gone further south and visited Africa's biggest economy, South Africa?
Well, I think relations between Israel and South Africa are well established, and I think that there is the perceived need to cement ties with the band of Central African countries that are democratizing, that are increasing their cooperation with both the Western powers, especially the United States of America, as well as Asian emerging nations like China, India, and of course Japan. It is in this context that Israel is seizing the opportunity to make the most of Africa's abundant natural resources, mineral resources, energy, especially in West Africa, Nigeria and Ghana, gold and diamonds in Ghana, and agricultural development in the Nile Basin, East African countries of Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda. And I think it's in this context that Israel is seizing the opportunity to provide technical expertise in areas that African countries lack that particular expertise in development and agriculture. It is also a very important aspect of Lieberman's visit is that he's taking along with him important officials from the Defense Ministry and the National Security Industry.
So let's talk about defense and national security a little bit later on. Sorry to interrupt you. Let's focus on the economic aspects of it a bit more, and the issue of water particularly. Hamdi Abdulrahman, do you think there's great significance in him visiting those Nile Basin countries?
Yes, let me say that Africa is a priority in the Israeli strategic thinking from the very beginning. So it is not a matter of opportunity now, but they had the opportunity since the beginning, the years of independence, when Israel opened an embassy in Ghana during the Independence Day in the late 50s. But it's a matter of shift now. So the strategic importance of Africa, it is considered by the Israeli decision makers as a battlefield between the Israeli and the Arabs. So I do remind you that the first leaders of Israel, Ben Gurion and the Golda Meir, tried to avoid the isolation policy imposed on them by the Arab from the very beginning through a strategy of encircling the circle of isolation by establishing alliances with the non-Arab regional power. You say Turkey, Iran before the revolution, and Ethiopia, which is very important in the Horn of Africa. So this is a concern from the beginning, and it is not a matter of conspiracy in the Arab world that we are looking at the Israeli hand, that they are working with the Nile Basin countries to put more pressure on Egypt and Sudan. At the last meeting of the Liberian state in Alexandria 2 months ago, there was a kind of consensus among the Egyptians that the Israeli hands behind the blocking to reach an agreement between the Liberian states. So this is actually, it is not a denial by the Israelis.
Well, you say it's not a conspiracy.
Interest in Africa.
You say it's not a conspiracy. We can take it even further, or rather the Libyan leader could take it even further. And this is where I bring in Herb Keenan. The Libyan leader a couple of days ago, Muammar Gaddafi, said that Israel is responsible for all of Africa's conflicts and the cause of all of Africa's woes. Interesting timing of that statement, just when Avigdor Lieberman is visiting the continent, isn't it, Herb Keenan?
Right, it is interesting. I think it's a bit of hyperbole. And I'd say that, Libya, Gaddafi has been trying to press the countries near Libya not to open up ties with Israel. Israel doesn't have ties with Chad, it doesn't have ties with Mali, it doesn't have ties with Niger, and to a large degree that's because of Libyan pressure on those countries not to reestablish or establish ties with Israel. So I think that he is concerned about inroads that Israel could make inside Africa, and because of that he's put pressure on the African countries. At that meeting he said that they should close down the embassies. So I think that that represents and manifests his concerns.
Yeah, one of the stated objectives here that I mentioned at the top, it says that better ties with the African countries will help Israel when it comes to getting votes on resolutions at the United Nations. Herb Keenan, surely that's not a stated goal, is it? I mean, the US veto is usually there for Israel, always at the UN.
Granted, but first of all, we don't know if it's always going to be there. Secondly, I think Israel has, I think Lieberman has realistic expectations of what he can get from the Africans. Again, the Africans they're influenced by other forces. I don't think that there's any real expectation that one trip to Africa is going to change the vote of the African countries in the UN or in other international forums. I think he's looking at this at the beginning. Again, there hasn't been a foreign minister who's gone to Africa since 1991. There hasn't been a prime minister who's gone there since 1988. So what he's trying to do is kind of just put down a stake and say, well, Israel hasn't forgotten about Africa. We remember the ties we had with Africa from the late 50s until 1973 in the war, and we'd like to get back in there. But whether or not tomorrow they're going to vote in mass at the UN against anti-Israel resolutions, I don't think anybody here really has those kinds of expectations.
Gamal and Nkrumah, both you and Hamdi Abdurrahman mentioned that Israel is seizing an opportunity here at a possible lack of Arab investment and Arab initiative in sub-Saharan Africa, and Israel's filling that void. How embarrassing is it for those Arab states, particularly those north of the Sahara on the African continent itself, that Israel is having growing influence in Africa?
I think it is very embarrassing and most unfortunate for the Arab countries, especially the key Arab countries like Egypt, for example, and Saudi Arabia, that can play a very positive role in Africa's development. The Israelis know exactly what the Africans need at this particular moment, which is technical expertise in specific areas such as defense, national security, and most importantly, agricultural development.
Mr. Nkrumah, we heard that it's mainly, sorry to interrupt you, we heard that it's mainly a defense deal with Nigeria. Why is that so?
Of course, Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa, and Nigeria is known to be embarking on a democratization process which has had a few hiccups in the past few years. It is fighting Islamic fundamentalists and militant Islamists in the northern parts of the country, as well as environmental activists in the south, in the oil-producing areas of the Delta. And the Nigerian government is desperate for this kind of technical expertise in defending the national interests and security interests of Nigeria. And a country like Israel, in spite of the fact that Nigeria is a Muslim majority nation, however, it is resorting to Israeli expertise in this area. Okay. And there is mutual understanding. The Nigerians understand that they need the Israelis in this respect, and the Israelis know that the Nigerians need them.
Okay, now let's take a brief look now at some of the other countries using the powerful economic tools that they have to assert their influence on African countries. First of all, China. It's Africa's top trading partner, mainly dealing in oil. Its trade volume with sub-Saharan Africa is about $107 billion. The US is at the second spot with $104 billion, 16% of its oil imports coming from Africa. Militarily, the US is looking for an African base for its regional command called AFRICOM. The European Union has allocated debt relief of up to $60 billion and over $120 million for good governance programs in Africa. And another prominent player in the region is Iran. Earlier this year, Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad visited several East African countries to form a united front. Iran has been steadily increasing its investments in Africa. Let's go back to Hamdi Abdurrahman. Realistically, what is the Iranian influence in Africa? Is it that big?
Yeah, it is not only Iran. There is a new scramble for Africa, which is everybody coming to Africa. So China, as you mentioned, United States, even Brazil from South America.
Yeah, but let's focus on Iran, because that's specifically what Israel is saying they want to counter in Africa. I'm trying to understand, how big is this Iranian influence?
Yes, because now the Israelis are afraid from the security concerns regarding the Islamic radicalism and the Iranian rule in East Africa and even in West Africa, with the falling and the soft states, whereas you can penetrate and you can give arms to rebel groups. So this is the main concern of the Israeli, and I think one of the main concern of the Israeli foreign minister is to counter the Iranian involvement in Africa.
Well, Herb, let's bring in. Sorry to interrupt you. Let's bring in Herb Keenan. Herb Keenan, surely the odd Iranian factory, whether it's a car factory or regarding any other project or product, doesn't really have much to do with Israel, does it? It's not part of an Iranian threat to Israel.
Look, I mean, I'd put the whole Iranian aspect of this trip in proper perspective. I think when Lieberman went to South America a month ago, I think that there Iran was very much on his mind, because the Iranians have made some serious inroads in South America. We know about Venezuela, El Salvador. There are countries there who are coming under heavy Iranian influence. I don't think that the situation right now is the same in Africa. You have Iranian influence in Sudan, but beyond that, it's not the same as it is in South America. So I don't think this is going to be a major focus. I think he's going to talk about the concerns that Israel has about Iranian influence, but it's not as real a threat there as it is in South America.
Gamal Nkrumah, you want to come in?
Yes, please. On this particular point, I would say that the Israelis are conscious that Iran has caught on the fact that Africa has the resources but needs the technical expertise, and this is where the Iranian threat to Israel comes in as a competitor, as opposed to the inertia of the Arab countries who are not contributing anything in that respect. Iran is offering a limited but effective technical expertise in several development areas that are important to African countries, and this is where the Israelis see Iran as a competitor and a threat to in Africa.
Hamdi Abdurrahman, I saw you nodding in agreement there.
Yes, I do agree with Gamal, because much of the popularity of the Israeli in Africa during the golden age in the 60s and 70s is because of the technical assistance, and they do know exactly what the African needs in agriculture, in the development of communal local communities, etc., etc. Now the Iranian do the same in these technical cooperation in many parts of Africa, even in the small countries like Comoros. The Iranians are there. In Nigeria, you have the influence of the Islamic Revolution with some of the main Islamic movements of Ibrahim al-Zakzaki.
Mr. Abdurrahman, are the Arab nations as threatened by Iran's influence in Africa as Israel is?
Yes, we have, even in Egypt, in some of the key Arab countries like Egypt, they have concern regarding the Iranian involvement, even especially in the Nile Basin and in the Horn of Africa. So we do the same concern regarding the Iranian factor in Africa.
Herb Keenan, looking at this from a different perspective, Avigdor Lieberman doesn't have the greatest relationship with the United States. He's not very well respected by even those Arab countries that have a peace deal with Israel, like Egypt and Jordan. He himself has made some outrageous statements in the past. He's called for the drowning of Palestinian prisoners. He's called for the killing of Arab-Israeli Knesset members who might meet with Hamas. With all of this in mind, given all of this, is it not wise for Israel to carve out this niche for Avigdor Lieberman in South America, in Africa, have him focus on this sort of thing, while other aspects of the Netanyahu government might actually focus on the Middle Eastern peace process?
That's an interesting analysis. I mean, I think one thing to keep in mind, however, is that in this case, it's not Netanyahu taking Lieberman out of the diplomatic loop with the Palestinians in the U.S. It's Lieberman taking himself out of the diplomatic loop. We have an interesting situation. We haven't had this, to my memory, in Israel in quite some time, where the foreign minister, who generally they fight each other to get inside onto the playing field when it comes to the relationship with the U.S. and with the Palestinians. Here you have the opposite taking place. Lieberman said, I'm not so sure that the diplomatic process right now with the Palestinians is going to bear fruit. I'm withdrawing from it. I'm not going to deal with it. I will deal with other areas which I, Avigdor Lieberman, think that Israel has ignored for too long, and I'll focus my energy on those areas. What are those areas? South America, Africa, public diplomacy. I mean, he said that soon after he came into power, and I think this is what we're seeing taking place right now.
Well, then, that does give us ominous signs for the future of Middle Eastern peace. Gamal and Kruma, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to wrap this up.
Well, I think in Africa, from an African perspective, Africans do not see Lieberman as a persona non grata. They see him as a representative of a country that has a great deal to offer to African economies and to African countries. And this is how he's perceived, not as a right-wing Israeli persona non grata, as he's regarded in the Arab world, say. In Africa, I think he would be made most welcome during his 9-day safari.
Gentlemen, we've reached the end of the discussion. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. It's been fascinating and interesting in Cairo, Jerusalem, and Dubai. Thanks again. And to our viewers, thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed the discussion, and we welcome your comments and suggestions. You can email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. See you soon.